Well, thank you. We're thrilled to be here today with four incredible panelists here to talk about why government essentially screws everything up. And so before we go any further, we're just going to start with some introductions. Jonathan, why don't you just kick us off?
Jonathan Small. I'm the president of the free market think tank in Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. My passion is freeing the most vulnerable from government dependency.
John Riches at the Goldwater Institute, named after the late, great Barry Goldwater. I'm the director of litigation at the Goldwater Institute, which means I get to sue bureaucrats for a living.
I'm Barry Loudermilk. I represent Georgia's 11th Congressional District, named after the late, great Barry Goldwater. And let me say, actors dream of being on Broadway, musicians dream of performing Carnegie Hall. I'm living my dream of being on the stage at CPAC.
Yeah, that's terrific.
I'm Tim Carney. I am the commentary editor at the Washington Examiner and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And my favorite thing to do is expose and battle against cronyism and corporate welfare. Terrific.
So I thought it'd be kind of fun. You know, our organization, Turning Point USA, you see some of our young activists out there. We have an expression called "Big Government Sucks." So we take a very, I guess you could say, strong position on this matter. But we also have a booklet called 50 Wacky Ways the Government Wastes Your Money. So I thought it'd be fun to kick it off to the panel. What are some of the most crazy examples of government waste that you've encountered, whether on the state policy level, the national level? Just anyone who wants to take that. Congressman, why don't you go first?
Well, there is so much, it's hard to wrap your arms around just one thing, but probably in the last 2 years I've been in Congress, the one that just struck me the most outrageous was the amount of money that one of our agencies, the Department of Homeland Security, paid over a 3-year period, paying employees to stay at home and not come to work. Up to $380 million was paid of taxpayer money to pay employees to stay at home and not work. And the reason is they have had disciplinary actions or they're under investigation, and it is so difficult to remove anybody from the federal payroll. It takes about 370 days to do that. So $380 million of your taxpayer dollars went to pay people to have up to, in one case, 2 years on the payroll without coming to work for a single day.
You know, speaking of employees that were hired to do a job and get paid by taxpayers to do that job, but then do something else entirely, there's this practice called release time or official time. And this is where the government pays government workers, taxpayer-funded salaries, to go and do nothing but work exclusively for government unions. And while they work for those government unions, they do things like political activities, lobbying, recruit new members, negotiate higher salaries in their contracts, essentially enhance their power, all at taxpayer expense. This exists at the federal, state, and local level. Federal government alone spends about $150 million a year on release time. The Veterans Administration spends $50 million a year on release time. You all might remember the VA scandal. While veterans were literally waiting, and in some cases dying while they were waiting for care, the Veterans Administration was paying government workers to go and ride a union desk instead.
You know, in Oklahoma, Barack Obama didn't win a single of the 77 counties, but, well, don't clap yet, because I'm about to tell you the horror story. We're actually implementing Obama's energy policy in Oklahoma. We literally pay wind companies over $100 million a year in subsidies. In fact, the state of Oklahoma had to borrow from other funds, general taxpayers' dollars, just to pay wind companies, all for a renewable portfolio standard that's crippling the state of Oklahoma.
It's incredible. Tim?
Well, I could go on about 1,000 things like the ethanol mandate or the Export-Import Bank, but I think I'm going to throw out a regulation there, actually. This isn't spending. This is the government requires your sort of mutual fund companies to send you these prospectuses, which you never read and you all throw immediately into the trash. Obama's administration actually, and you can opt out of it, Obama's administration actually considered making it easier to opt out. They stopped because of the pressure they were getting from the envelope lobby. Literally, the envelope lobby and the paper lobby make so much money off of this mandate. It is literally waste. They are murdering trees to profit some industries, and it wouldn't be happening if not for big government regulation.
The envelope lobby, I haven't heard that one before. So I want to get into kind of incentives. Why is it that government is so inefficient and inherently wasteful? And why is the private sector able to do it so much better? And while we're having these conversations with our friends and our family and trying to persuade people about the difference between free enterprise solutions and government waste, let's talk a little bit about the why. Why is government so wasteful? And no matter how hard we try to make it, the left always likes to say, well, we're just not running it right yet. Let's dive into, no matter how many bureaucrats they have, no matter how many central planners, why is it government will always get it wrong and the private sector will always get it right? Congressman.
Well, I think it's several factors. One, the government is too big. The government is too centralized and it's too empowered. And more importantly, it's trying to do things it was never designed or empowered to do. I think another thing you have to look at is how does it earn its revenue? It doesn't have to earn its revenue. It obtains its revenue basically by the point of gun or by the force of law, where the free enterprise or private institutions, they have to earn it. Even those who get government contracts, they have to perform to actually receive the money, where the government itself, it doesn't have to be frugal with taxpayer money. It doesn't have to look after it because it's somebody else's money.
Jonathan.
I agree with that. Daniel Webster said that the power to tax is necessarily the power to destroy. We see that every day in Oklahoma. I think the other thing is, once government creates a program, new constituencies are created, special interests are created, and they're all about trying to continue their existence, not trying to help those that services are for. And so the incentives are all wrong for government, because if you think about it, they never have to compete for the resources that they need.
Yeah, I want to pile on that. I think that's exactly right. The special interests, people who are profiting from big government, are a huge part of the reason that government wastes, that these wasteful programs stay in. You see it all over the place. The defense spending, when we talk about these hammers, these fighter jets that cost way too much, that's because of the military-industrial complex. It's not just the Pentagon's bad. There's vested interests in the waste. They have more say because they hire the former senator as their lobbyist, and so they have a lot more say. There's not really a powerful lobby for taxpayers, unfortunately. There is a powerful lobby for the people who are living off of the largesse of big government.
And John, this is a problem for both parties, and I know Goldwater Institute has had the courage to stand up to both parties in Arizona and nationally. I want to talk a little bit about how this is not just a Democrat problem, but bipartisan, love of growing government. Just different programs for different parties.
It's a bipartisan issue, and I think it's just simply a problem with central planning. This is the fatal conceit that the government knows better than you do. And when Boris Yeltsin came and visited the Johnson Space Center, it wasn't the space technology that amazed him. It was a grocery store that he visited right after that. And he went to the grocery store and he was amazed by the amount of things that were available from all different parts of the world at extremely low costs. And he compared that to a Soviet breadline. And what he recognizes, which what everyone in this room knows, the government doesn't have the information to make decisions for us, and it can't. Innovation can't be centrally planned. Prices can't be controlled by fiat. That's the role for markets. And when you have a bureaucrat in Washington trying to determine how many bananas are going to be consumed in Des Moines, it won't work because it can't work. And when the government tries to do those things, it fails.
Yeah, absolutely, Congressman.
This is the swamp. What we're defining here is what's been defined as the swamp. And for too long, Congress and a lot of organizations, we focused on killing alligators. But you can't kill the alligators till you drain the swamp to start with.
That's a great point and a great segue to something I wanted to touch on, which one of the things I was most proud of that President Trump did right out of the gate was a federal hiring freeze. And I think it's really interesting. You can make a compelling argument that government is much smaller today than it was when he signed that order, because every day over 200 government bureaucrats retire, and we're not replacing those bureaucrats. So government's already smaller without Congress actually doing anything. So I think we should all give President Trump recognition for that. But we have to realize that with every bureaucrat, it's not just that fixed cost. It's the pension cost. It is the travel cost. It is the housing cost. It is also the cost they put on the economy, too. We can't forget, it's not just the $85 hammer or the Boeing 737 that's way too expensive that we're paying for, but it's also the cost that they're putting on the economy, which I know that you're dealing with in Oklahoma with regulation. So, John, I'd love to have you talk about not just the cost that we're spending, but it's the hidden cost of the regulation that they're putting on business that makes the cost of production even more expensive for the private sector.
No, you bring up a really good point, Charlie. I mean, in Oklahoma, so Oklahoma determined that Obamacare's Medicaid expansion wasn't the right direction for us. But for the last 5 years, our Medicaid agency has spent time trying to force Obamacare's Medicaid expansion on Oklahoma. They've literally grown the rolls of our Medicaid program 124% over the last 2 decades, grown our state share costs by 556%, all while asking Oklahomans for more money. And I think this goes to the problem is that policy matters and your ideology matters. You either tend to believe that humans are the ones that can best help themselves flourish, or that government is. And so many government bureaucrats really believe that it's government why people flourish, and it's generally individuals left up to their own that are going to cause problems.
Right. Tim, I know we talked about this a little bit before, but just the distinction of how government approaches a problem, whether it be the VA or transportation, how the private sector approaches a problem. Do you want to touch a little bit on that?
Well, I mean, the biggest difference, and that was already hinted at, was are we going to rely on the wisdom and the sort of, we're going to get enough data and we're going to get enough smart people and we're going to make a big decision, or is it going to be dispersed decision making? And the key is that in the private sector, it's not that CEOs are smarter than our government executives, it's that there's competition, and all these different CEOs, the ones who have the wrong ideas, guess what? Their company goes out of business, or they adapt and they see what the good guys are doing. It's not that there's more wisdom in the private sector than in the government sector, it's that there's competition in the private sector, and that doesn't exist in the government sector.
Right. Congressman, do you have a thought on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the purpose that a lot of these bureaucracies exist, is not to do the mission that they're doing, but it's to protect their institution. It's not to serve the American people. Originally, a lot of them were, but they have morphed into these big bureaucracies to where sometimes you have second and third generation bureaucrats who have never, ever worked within the industry that they're regulating. I tell people this way, a lot of these folks have only ever signed the back of a paycheck. They never, ever have signed the front of the paycheck. So they don't know what it is that their regulation is doing. And something that he had mentioned earlier, we have to also look at the cost of these regulations on the individual taxpayer. The average American family pays over $15,000 a year in hidden regulatory taxes. That's money coming out of your pocket. You want to get this economy going, let's get the regulation off the backs of the businesses, which will get them off the backs of the individual taxpayer and put more money in their pocket.
That's a great point. And when we communicate with young people on college campuses, a great example we use is how Uber broke the back of the taxi cab unions, which was essentially a pseudo-government monopoly. And people never thought, wow, I never knew transportation could be so cheap, so accessible, so quick, so accountable. And that's really the difference, because we just grew accustomed to, taxi cabs are always going to be hell and we just have to pay a lot for it. And all of a sudden, the private sector came and just disrupted that industry completely. So I want to use that as a segue. Absolutely, yes. Yeah. I want to use that as a segue. How can the citizens in this room and watching at home, how can we hold the government accountable to have those same sort of disruptions, those same sort of positive changes? And what concrete, tangible steps can all the amazing activists here do to enforce more free enterprise, private sector solutions as we look at just government regulation and government control one after the other? John, we'd love to have you start with that.
Demand less from your government. Barry Goldwater said that his aim wasn't to pass laws, but to repeal them. And when you call your lawmakers and tell them stories about how government abuses have affected you, they will listen. So tell your story. If there is a law or a regulation that's preventing you from starting a business or speaking your mind or engaging with your community in a meaningful, effective way, notify your lawmakers of that. Notify the media of that, and tell your story, because there's real harm that's being done, and unless those stories get out there, nothing will be done about it.
Jonathan, I know you run a state think tank where you're all about holding people accountable, and so please.
No, I think a really important point is, the election was a great time. We should all be encouraged by that. But if you think about it as it relates to sports, when you pick your team, you're just starting. So all that's really happened for us is that the roster's been set, particularly at the state level. Politicians like for you to be completely focused on what's happening here in D.C., when often state government is working just as much against your interests, even as the federal government might be. So I would encourage people to now turn their attention to what's happening at your state houses. One of the examples of something that's moving across the country right now, the great next scourge for America is sugary drinks. You may have heard of it. If we don't put a tax on sugary drinks and reduce the amount of juice that people drink, we're all gonna die, apparently. That's an area where citizens need to get involved and say, it's not government's job to determine what I eat or drink. It's government's job to get out of the way and protect property.
So go ahead, please.
I think that's great. And When I look at the threats to free enterprise and to the idea of limited government, a lot of times, again, I always come back to the fact that most of these bad laws wouldn't get into place unless usually a big business wasn't lobbying for it and benefiting from it. So we need to, while we're holding our politicians accountable, we also need to do what the left does well, which is they'll protest and boycott some company that does something they don't like. Guess what? If General Electric is lobbying to take away the regular light bulb so you have to buy the more expensive one, that's something where conservative free market consumers need to object. If some other company is lobbying for a subsidy, even if you want to have your hockey team there in Phoenix, and you shouldn't be lobbying for a subsidy, you have to know and oppose it so that they feel a cost. They feel a cost now for upsetting the left. They should feel a cost for using big government to profit as well.
So Congressman, I do a lot of traveling and talking to grassroots activists, young and old, and they're so thrilled we won. But honestly, I feel a little impatient. People want to see government get smaller. They want to see the budget get balanced. Not to put you too much on the spot, but can you give us an update of when we're going to start to see these reforms that we were promised start to get implemented in the halls of Congress?
Well, they're on the way, and one of the things you have to realize, the founders put into place a system of legislation that was slow, and it was purposely slow, because the idea of the founders was laws are an infringement upon liberty. And some of them are good, but every law is some type of infringement on liberty, and it should be very difficult to get those through. So our process is slow, it's purposefully slow. We have to honor the process. If we don't need to violate those constitutional principles as we go forward, but we also need to utilize every parliamentary procedure and everything that we can do to push it through. We're already seeing some of those go through. Something called the Congressional Review Act allows Congress to actually undo any executive policy or regulation that was implemented by the previous administration, and that time frame takes us back to June. We've already passed 10 of those. They're over to the Senate. We're expecting as soon as the Senate gets done with the confirmations, because of their time constraints there, they're going to start taking these up. You already see the president issuing executive orders. But one of the challenges we have in Congress is, over the decades, we've advocated our Article I powers. It's our responsibility to hold these regulatory agencies in check. And as I have actually chaired an oversight committee, I have a subcommittee. I've been frustrated by how much these agencies ignore subpoenas by Congress, because we don't have the tools to hold them accountable. That's why, as a member of the Article I project, we're working to regain those Article I powers so we can actually constrain the growth of this government. And where we need your help is get excited. We won. We're winning. We're finally winning. It's almost like we're still in a state of shock. We need to have that same fortitude and that same drive that we had over the last 8 years as we were fighting on defense. Now we have an opportunity to be on offense and share those stories. The left fights on emotion. We need to be able to fight on the same emotion, because we actually have the solutions that are right for America by putting the power back in the hands of the people.
Well said. Thank you. So John, something I know that the Goldwater Institute fights a lot for is school choice and educational choice, and also in Oklahoma as well. I want to talk about this because this is a great example of government failure over the last 60 years that is, again, tying into this theme of cronyism. And something that I learned and I ran across coming from Chicago, this thing called a rubber room, which essentially is a physical building in downtown Chicago where they keep teachers that they cannot fire. So they've been so bad, sometimes have committed crimes, they have to put them in a physical building outside of the class. They report to there every single day. They get full pension, full salary, but there's such a disturbance to a student's educational future, they have to remove them from the classroom and put them, and you know what? The rubber room's turned into a rubber building. And this is an example of how right now government has failed our inner cities the last 60 years with these government-run schools. Talk a little bit about school choice, what this administration is trying to do through the nomination of Betsy DeVos, and how we can push back against this failure of government-run schools and an opportunity we have for the liberty movement moving forward.
So here's the question, and here's the choice we have. Do you think that a number of government bureaucrats should be making decisions that are best for you and your family, or do you think that those decisions are best made around the kitchen dinner table? And when it comes to school choice, this is, for the first time in history maybe, an opportunity for people to make their own choices that would never be accessible to them. This allows people to get out of failing schools, to get out of the inner city, and to have access to real educational opportunities. And there is a variety of programs, mostly at the state level, and the federal government can do a lot in this regard. Educational savings accounts, vouchers. ESAs are a great program. This is where, rather than you just being relegated to attend the school that's in your zip code, you get a debit card. And rather than the state paying the cost of education in your zip code, it gives you and your family that money, and you can go and spend that at the school of your choice, whether it's public or charter or private or homeschooling. And oh, by the way, if there's some money left over, maybe you could roll that over into college tuition and the like. So there's some very exciting developments in school choice. There's some real solutions, and if we really want to change education in this country, we really got to get behind a lot of these school choice programs.
And Charlie, I might say, just talk about how important this issue is. The reason why the left opposed Betsy DeVos the most is because they want to keep trapped the most vulnerable in the indoctrination camps, if I can just go ahead and say it. And prevent them from having the opportunity to fully be empowered to stop generational poverty. That's the other area where we as a movement need to get involved at the local level. It's fascinating to me that it's okay for every other government service to allow choice, except for K through 12 education. That argument is inconsistent. If we truly care about the most vulnerable, we're going to work hard to get them out of a system that's not working for them and put them somewhere where they're going to be able to succeed. And that's why the left opposes that issue the most, because once they lose the ability to control the minds of our kids, they lose the ability to control the culture in the United States of America.
That's really well said.
And one of the worst sort of counter arguments against school choice that we saw when they were opposing DeVos in the Senate was you had Congressman Chris Murphy from Connecticut. He says, "Well, I turned out great coming out of a public school, and I came out of a great public school too." And what's the term the left uses? Check your privilege. I looked up where Chris Murphy went to public school. It was right down the road from Loomis Chaffee, the private school. So he went to the public school. Guess what? To live in that school district where Chris Murphy went to school, you have to be a lot wealthier than you do to send your kids to the Catholic school where I send my kids. So it is a privilege that it's a more walled, gated community, these really wealthy suburbs with really nice public schools. And what we're doing is we're threatening, if we offer a voucher, we're threatening to send in the deplorables from outside of that walled community into their public school. That's half of what they're afraid of.
That's right. And I have to say one thing. The only reason Vice President Pence had to break that tie is because of two Republicans that were bought by the public sector teacher unions, Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski. And for those Republicans that are not on the right side of school choice, they got to go. I'm telling you right now, because I'm telling you right now, this is an issue that we can build broad consensus on. The fact that the Vice President had to break a tie for the first time for a cabinet appointment because our own party won't stand for poor kids in poor cities. Those two senators, whoever's from Maine or Alaska, you got your work cut out for you. But anyway, so it's a great example, and you can see the passion for this issue because it cuts all across lines. You know, I went to a public school, you know, in northwest suburbs of Chicago, but you know what? I look at some of the people that I went to high school with. Thankfully, you know, it was a good public school, but I see other people across town that were in a good area. They should have had that opportunity to go to a better school. So, Congressman, talk a little about this issue and just in general, how we can build these consensus around free enterprise solutions to communities we wouldn't otherwise be communicating with.
Well, I think regarding your previous question, I think we need to also look at the cabinet appointees that Trump is making across the board. They're all people that understand what is wrong with the agencies of which they're going to be heading, and that's something in itself to be excited about. My parents always told me, you're known by the company you keep, and he's keeping some really, really good company that I think is one of the things that's going to head us in the right direction. We have to be very aggressive. Right now, we have a short time. We have a short window. This is the most incredible opportunity that Americans have had, not just conservatives, but when we implement our policies, every American will benefit from it. I don't care if you're the ones out there protesting, you're going to benefit from lower taxes. You could be some of those out there that are the thousands of people calling my office every day, saying the worst possible things that you could say to my staff employees. You will benefit from an improved education system. But we have to show the people that our values work, and that it's going to take a lot of work, but it's going to happen in a very short amount of time. We have basically 2 years to start turning the tide on this nation. And that's why we have to be very aggressive. I had our staff here this week. I said, this is the time that we go big, we go bold, or we just go home. Now is the time. And that's one of the reasons that we're pushing legislation like the Merit Act, which basically gets rid of this old policy of being able to get in the government, game the system, and stay on the payroll, even while you've been indicted for conspiracy, and you can stay on the government payroll. You got 7 to 14 days, you're gone.
It's really well said. And you know, I think this really illustrates a broader point as we look to close the loop on this panel, is as all the people here in this room are looking, what can I do about this? Well, you know what? What if we all stormed town halls like Chuck Schumer's town hall and started saying, why don't you support school choice? Why don't you support these options? So, hey, the work is not yet done. We might have set the table properly. There was a great analogy or metaphor made earlier. I think, Jonathan, you made it earlier, where you said, we have all the troops in the right position. Now we have to go take the territory. And we have to have the courage to pass this legislation and to actually have the wherewithal to implement this meaningful reform. And so I would just love to get some closing thoughts to these activists out here, because all of us, we're on the front lines, and the activists here on the front lines, just kind of, what are your thoughts of what does success look like in the next 2 years? How can we gauge that success? How can we hold our elected officials accountable? Because we can't lose this opportunity. I mean, House, Senate, presidency, more state chambers ever controlled than any other time, more governors' mansions across the country. I mean, we're never going to have an opportunity to implement reform like this. So I'd love Jonathan to kick it off, please.
And I think the first place where we would start is that for all of us, the next time you get an email from your public school administrator on government email telling you to oppose your state lawmaker trying to promote a school choice bill, let that lawmaker know that that offends you and that you're going to work to stop that kind of activity. I think the next thing is that I think all of us should commit to that over the next legislative session that we're going to take action on at least 3 pro-free market ideas. And when a lawmaker proposes that idea, we're going to call him and congratulate him and help push that among our own communities. And then when even our own people get out of line and do what they're not supposed to do. The governor in Oklahoma is trying to increase taxes by $2 billion on Oklahomans right now. We're leading that effort to stop her. If you're a friend of free markets, limited government, and individual initiative, we should support those people. If you're not, our goal is going to be to try to stop you and hopefully see that you don't return from office.
John.
Where do we see the greatest abuses of power? I think that's an important question, and I think it's also a question of accountability. And where we see the greatest abuses of power are those that are least accountable, which is oftentimes the regulatory state. So you have a situation in our federal regulatory agencies, our state regulatory agencies. They make the rules, they investigate alleged violations of the rules, they adjudicate violations of the rules, and then, oh, by the way, if you ever take that administrative agency to court, that's some of what we do, the court's obligated to defer to what the agency did. That kind of sounds like something out of a Banana Republic. It doesn't sound much like the rule of law. So we need to support these efforts to rein in the regulatory state. Why don't we sunset these regulatory agencies and let them come to lawmakers and justify their existence and support reforms that can limit the size and scope of this unaccountable dark government?
Congressman.
Talking about these regulatory agencies, the EPA is one of the worst out there. It totally is off of its mission. It no longer cares about the environment. And I love the environment. I want to protect the environment. That's why I co-sponsored legislation to eliminate the EPA, because it needs to be replaced with a smaller agency that works with the states and Congress to determine what our policy is and let the states enforce it. That's how we protect our environment. But this is where you become very important. You need to keep doing what you've been doing over the last 8 years. After we co-sponsored that legislation, my office, in a series of just a few days, received over 1,000 phone calls of some of the most abusive people calling. All but 5 were opposed to the legislation. We're going to keep going in the direction we're going, but if I'm in a very conservative district, I'm only getting 5 phone calls supporting what we're doing. Imagine what those in swing districts are getting. We need to make our voice just as loud as it's been over the last 8 years.
My old boss was Bob Novak, the columnist, and one of the things he said was, he said as a general thing, not to all politicians as a class are up to no good. Another saying he liked to quote other people saying was, Politics isn't about getting somebody to do the right thing for the wrong reason. It's about getting other politicians to do the right things for the wrong reason, for whatever reason they want. And so that means you have to make it painful for them to do the wrong thing. So everybody who came on this stage, every politician who came up here said, I'm a conservative, I'm with you, they will have different incentives than the rest of us. They will have things including industry lobbyists, including the polls, including their friends who are consultants. They will have people pulling them in the other direction. And this applies to President Trump as well. We need to be pulling on the other end of the rope, and that means we can't just go and say, we've got your back. No, we've got your back as long as you're marching in the right direction. Otherwise, you're gonna feel our bayonet at your back.
That's well said. So, what a great panel, and I mean, for everyone out here, for now that we control the House and the Senate and the presidency, you know, for every one Democrat you hold accountable, hold 2 Republicans accountable, because if we don't get the job done, it's our fault. So with that, thank you so much. It was a wonderful discussing with you today, and please give it up for our wonderful panel again. So thank you so much.